Welcome to We and Lewis, a podcast dedicated to celebrating the remarkable, creative, and energetic people who live in Lewis and are helping our community forge a collective soul as appealing as it is unique. These are their stories in their words. They are the we in Lewis. I'm Kevin McGinnis. Our guest today is Tom Sheridan, the president of the highly respected Sheridan Group, a legislative advocacy group whose motto is to help the good do better. Some of his successes include the bipartisan Ryan-White CARE Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Bono's One campaign, and a joint initiative that culminated in the creation of the White House Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation. He's also been a roadie, an author, a social worker by training, and an active member in a variety of boards and charities. Here in Lewis, he's president of the much-admired Children's Beach House. Today's episode is brought to you by the sister restaurants of Kindle and Half Full. Located in downtown Lewis, Kindle offers seasonal American fare with a bit of a French influence, as well as an amazing selections of wine by the glass. It's also known for its weekly specials. Right next door, Half Full focuses on gourmet pizza and wine. For the 2% of America not interested in these essential food groups, it also has delicious soups, salads, and an amazing array of desserts. Today's episode is being recorded at the bar at Kindle. Unfortunately, at the moment, neither the bar nor the kitchen is open. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Kevin. Glad to be with you.
Tom, you wrote a book entitled Helping the Good Do Better, How a White Hat Lobbyist Advocates for Change. The words white hat and lobbyist are rarely found in the same sentence. What's the meaning of the term?
Well, the traditional white hat, black hat kind of cowboy thing. But, for years and years, I would try and explain to people, mostly friends of my parents, that I was a lobbyist, but not like a lobbyist that, they thought of a K Street, corporate lobbyist. That I was a lobbyist for people who needed really great lobbyists, but frequently couldn't afford them or didn't know actually how to do that work. So I kind of just coined the term white hat lobbyist because it just made a distinction that was kind of easier to understand, on behalf of the good guys and working for the kind of common social good. When I first started the firm, everyone basically said I was mad, complete madness, that that not-for-profits would never hire lobbyists, and you could never make a business out of not-for-profit lobbying. It's before the term social enterprises was invented, so I guess I am now, at 36 years in the business, I am a social enterprise, but the idea didn't exist that you could dedicate yourself to kind of not-for-profit missions, but still try and function as a business. So I just honestly created it to try and stop those odd looks at cocktail parties and the disapproving glare of my mother, who said, couldn't you just tell people you do something else? So I created that out of necessity, largely out of family necessity, to be honest.
I think for lobbyists, which I was one, when someone calls themselves the white hat lobbyist or the good lobbyist, so it's like, oh, really? Yeah. But when you look at your accomplishments, when you look at the organizations that you work with, I mean, they range from disease education programs to childhood education to Harvard to anti-poverty groups, to only name some. So how did you get started?
So I had run the domestic AIDS lobby for 5 years, and it was an incredible 5-year journey, but I was turning 30 and I was burning out. It was, full of rage, death. I mean, literally we would have volunteers coming to the office during the week, and the weekend would happen, and on Monday, 3 or 4 volunteers would not be there for the next week's worth of work. And they died over the weekend, usually of pneumocystis. And so that ACT UP was at its prime. I was sometimes their favorite person to hate because I was the compromiser, which always gave me a great sense of I was in the right spot. Always be in the middle, and you're doing the right thing. So it was a very difficult period of time, to be doing the work. The politics was harsh. There was a lot of rage, homophobia. The religious right was on its ascendancy, and they kind of emerged as the opposition, a very powerful opposition. As usual, we did not have the resources that the opposition had. So it was 5 years worth of incredibly important and ultimately very successful work. But I had said to my partner, my husband now, at the time, that I wanted to spend I've always dreamed of going to Africa, and that I'd always dreamed of maybe climbing Kilimanjaro, and that's what I wanted to do for my 30th birthday. And so I was kind of standing at the top of Kilimanjaro on my 30th birthday and thought, I have to do something else. I can't just do one issue, and I can't just keep doing this issue successfully. So when I came home, I basically thought to myself, maybe what I could do is just work for people like the AIDS community that need somebody who can really put a strategy together and make it successful, but do it for multiple different groups, and find those groups that are kind of both the most needy, but also the most ready to do the kind of work that you have to do to get political success and political change to happen. So that's what happened. By January of that year, I decided I would leave AIDS Action and start my own project. I really just thought it was going to be a series of different projects that I could kind of dip in and out of. The idea of starting a business was not actually in my head, stupidly probably. I called it the Sheridan Group because I didn't want to call it Tom Sheridan and Associates. It all sounded too K Street and icky. And group, I'm a social worker, so the group thing sounded, kind of groovy and, softer and more collaborative. And I literally went to a print store, and I got my card. I just made up the name and had it printed. And that was the beginning of, and I didn't actually think it was going to be a firm. I thought it was just going to be a series of projects. And then it just grew and grew and grew. And as Tom Harkin, a former senator from Iowa, used to say to me, I was like Mother Teresa, that I was like St. Jude, the patron saint of hopeless cases. And that every time I came to his office, I was like Mother Teresa's waiting room. I had like every, hopeless case, attached to me at the backside of it. But I have to actually say, after 36 years, it was, I never had a client that I didn't genuinely respect and deeply care about trying to help them achieve their goals. I never got up any morning doing politics in this century feeling embarrassed or ashamed or bad about the work that I was doing. I got up every day and thought, I'm going to go help something good happen. And that sounds maybe a little Pollyanna. I mean, there's a lot of bad days, particularly on the good guy side. You get beat a lot. You get outspent. You get outmaneuvered. You get out a lot of things. So there are deeply disappointing days in this work. But, as I always say to people, when you win, just, you transform whatever the issue, whatever the moment is in time. And so it's worth the work to be able to do that. And, it is rewarding.
Was it after Kilimanjaro that you kind of went from being a traditional lobbyist advocate, and then you started creating campaigns? Right. You kind of became both the leader and the strategist.
Right. So, yeah, it was after that. So as the firm was growing, that became a very important part of what we offered as a service to folks. Frequently, they knew they had an issue, they knew they had a problem, but they had no idea how to approach framing that issue, how to go about building a coalition around it. So it did become kind of an all-in-one shop. I remember about 10 years into running the firm, I finally kind of hired a business consulting because my staff was revolting of what a bad businessman I was. So I hired a business consultant to kind of help me think it through. And he said, this is the wrong model. That, a consulting firm is they have one product. They just cut and paste different names and things into it, but you never reinvent your product. That's how you make money. And I was like, I can't do that. Like, people don't come with one problem or one thing that's wrong. Like, it's all of the campaigns that I've run, both winners and losers campaigns, are all literally constructed out of whole cloth because everyone's assets are different. The assets of one group are not going to be the assets of another group. Where one group may have a little bit of money, another group will not. One may have a great grassroots operation, the other ones will not. So you always have to kind of put the pieces together, which is where, in the book, I came up with this idea that basically great campaigns have 3 Ps as essential elements. And the 3 Ps became my kind of, honestly, the consulting model, which is as long as people could focus on having those 3 things in their toolbox, whatever levels of degree they could have them, as long as they had those things present, they could ultimately put together a successful campaign.
One of the challenges that other lobbyists and lawyers face is the client comes in. It can be the head of an organization, the CEO. They're masterful at describing the problem. you then have to ask them, so you have a chance of succeeding, is what do you want? If God says you won, what did you win? And I have found that stumped a lot of people.
It does.
They had no idea, and they would literally go, we'll get back to you. And they'd walk out, and then they'd come back.
And not-for-profits particularly are great at problem articulation because that's what they do. They sit in the middle of problems and they try, but they're not very good at solution articulation. And frequently, they don't even know where the solution would come from. They're kind of delivered problems that they then try and ameliorate in front of them. But the idea of solving the problem actually is never always put to them. I like to work for not-for-profits whose mission says to eradicate or to end or to make, past their problem. But most not-for-profits aren't actually geared that way. They're much more geared toward putting the Band-Aid on the problem, not so much at getting to the source of the problem and then actually solving that at a deep level. So I found my most successful partnerships were people who either re-engineered their mission or had as their mission the notion of actually solving the problem and a clear way of thinking about how that would happen. But it is rare. And it's good to hear on the other side of K Street you had a similar problem. And also when you're on the Hill, I used to tell people going to the Hill when we train them to go up every day, is like, they will hear 1,000 problems today. 1,000 people will come and say, what's wrong? The person that's actually going to get their attention is the person that says, and here's how we fix it. And if you stay in that conversation, that's where you're going to get your success.
Absolutely. Not everyone is familiar with the Ryan White Act, but you were there at its inception. You worked with both sides of the aisle, withstood the expected challenges and some non-expected, and ended up passing legislation with a near veto-proof bipartisan majority. How did you take an issue that few considered a priority and turn it into something that in the end was considered must-pass legislation?
Great question. So actually, your old boss, Kevin, was kind of gave me the first clue. So when we were passing the research bill, what we realized a year and a half, almost 2 years before Ryan White, we had the AIDS Research and Prevention Act. And it was really aimed at kind of the microscope, the NIH, the white labs, coats, that, it was kind of devoid of gay, it was devoid of sex, it was devoid of all the things that made AIDS so controversial in its early days. And it was just straight up science. And your boss was a champion on that piece of legislation. And what we recognized is that if we could find platforms that people did not get trapped in the controversies of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, as we used to say, if you could avoid that space, you could get people into the right position on the issue, or make it safer for them to approach it politically. And what we realized is that there were, particularly in the more, let's say, sincere religious right-wing circles, there was a real sense of compassion for people who were sick and dying. It actually honestly came in my conversation with my grandmother when I first took the job at AIDS Action. I didn't actually want to take the job at AIDS Action. I thought it was a very bad idea for somebody who thought he might have a budding political career to put my head in that noose and jump. And I was home for Easter, and I was just discussing it with my grandmother, who was the matriarch of our big Irish Catholic family. And I said, what do you think about this idea, Nana? These people with AIDS, and they're people who serve them, are looking for somebody to help them in Washington. And she said that she had been reading the Catholic News, which was her favorite newspaper, that previous Sunday, and that she had read an article that Mother Teresa was helping people with AIDS. And I just looked at her, and she kind of looked at me, and there's a little awkward silence. And she said, "What I don't understand, Thomas, is if it's good enough for Mother Teresa, why wouldn't it be good enough for you?"
Oh, wow.
And I was like, wow. And she's very conservative, off the boat Irish, went to mass every day. Like, she would not have been in the constituency of, progressive AIDS activists by any stretch of the imagination. But she could recognize the charity, the spiritual demand to take care of people when they're sick. And we realized that if we could find a way to write something that was about caring for people, not judging how they got there, just about caring for them, that we could actually get Republicans particularly on board. And your boss, your former boss, Orrin Hatch, loved working with Senator Kennedy. They had a great kind of odd couple relationship. And Kennedy said, this is a perfect bill for Hatch. So we actually took it to you. It was a year in development and introduction, et cetera. And then as we were getting ready to mark the bill up, you would understand this, Kevin, it's kind of inside Washington speak, but we were getting ready to mark the bill up. And that was the week that Ryan White went into the hospital and was dying. And I had known Ryan and his mother, Jeannie, well. We'd done a lot of stuff with them together. But we had not named the bill for him until it was being marked up in the Senate that day, and he was still alive. And your boss came into the anteroom, the little office there, and said to Kennedy, let's name the bill for Ryan. Was in the headlines that day. Let's name the bill for Ryan White. And I said I was fine with it, but I wouldn't do it unless Jeannie was okay with it, unless she approved it. I didn't want her to think we were using it. And he was on his deathbed, so it felt a little awkward. So so given your boss and Senator Kennedy, they just picked up the phone and called the hospital and got Jeannie on the phone. And she got on the phone. Elton John was with her in the room at that hour. Wow. And they asked if it was okay. And Jeannie said, I would be honored. And literally they marched out into the anteroom. Your boss made the motion to rename the bill, the Ryan White Care Act. And then in that moment, in the clarity and the innocence that Ryan White brought to the issue, and he did, and he brought it to the country, people saw that hating people that had the disease was not a productive nor thoughtful way to respond. He was a 14-year-old kid. So in kind of just that moniker and that inspiration behind the bill just gave it wings, and it flew from that point forward.
I don't think it's hard to imagine how difficult it is to take a controversial issue to an issue that can pass with such a big number. And I wanted to emphasize it because I think it is a real tribute to what you've been able to accomplish.
Well, thank you. But we had a 100 member organization coalition behind that bill. So like what I like to tell people is the work that sometimes the window of opportunity is not available. You don't see it. It's a little too far away. We built that coalition over 3 years, member by member, until we had the American Medical Association, the Nurses Association, the Bar Association. We had every major public health, education, service organization, National Association of Social Workers. I'm a social worker. They were all part of the coalition. Catholic Charities USA. It was a big target of mine because I was, inspired by my grandmother's story. I'm like, I need that imprimatur. And Catholic Charities says, the bishops did not want them necessarily on that bill, and they kind of pushed forward and did some really brave stuff. But when you have 100 organizations in Washington, D.C., all united around a common solution to a problem, politicians like to get out in front of parades that are created for them and just grab the baton, and we did that. But I think sometimes the mythology around Ryan White or even the ADA and some of those other bills that kind of seemingly came out of nowhere and were very successful in a short period of time. What I don't think people always recognize is the block and tackle work that happened before that window of opportunity opened.
How did you meet Bono?
So Senator Kennedy was just an incredible man and person and friend. But he only had one person in his head because he had so many things he cared about. There was one person in his head for every issue that he cared about. So his nephew, Bobby, who was in the music industry, was working with Bono. They had gone on a trip on one of the famine relief trips and realized that AIDS was a huge problem in Africa. And Bono was really inspired by, and horrified by particularly the AIDS orphans that were all over Africa and starving as well, part of the poverty program. So he and Bobby started to think about how to work on this issue and how to kind of bring a better, higher level of recognition to the international AIDS issue. So Bobby called his uncle Teddy, and Teddy said, "Oh, you got to call Tom Sheridan. He's the AIDS guy." And so Vicky called me and said,
Vicky is his wife.
Vicky's his wife, and a very dear friend to this day. And so Vicky called and she said, Bobby's working on this thing on AIDS, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I don't really, do a lot on it. And international AIDS was just starting to appear. But I said, look, I ran the domestic AIDS lobby, and, I can certainly run circles around anyone on the subject of domestic AIDS, but international AIDS is kind of beyond the pale for me. And thought it was done. And about 3 or 4 days later, Teddy called and he said, Bobby really needs help on this thing. I really want him to talk to you. No commitment, but just talk to Bobby and say that you'll help. And he's working with this rock star named Bon Jovi. So I was like, okay. So 2 or 3 days later, the phone rings, and I think my assistant says it's Bon Jovi. Just what I heard, because it was kind of, I guess, in the back of my head somewhere. So I pick up the phone, and I'm starting this conversation with this rock star who I think his name is Bon Jovi, and all of my grandparents came from Ireland. They all had Irish brogues. So I don't really hear it. It's just kind of a very natural, it just sounds normal in my ear. So I'm talking to him, and he does have a little bit of a brogue, but it's more actually gravelly as a voice. So we're going on and talking about it and why he's inspired to do it. And they said, at the end of the day, what people are going to want to know is, why does a rock star from New Jersey really care about people with AIDS? And he dead quiet. I, of course, have to double down and say, it's not that hard a question, but it is the important question you have to answer. He said, well, it probably is an important question, but I'm not from New Jersey. And he said, maybe we should start again. And I was like, and I was confused at that point. He said, my name is Bono. I have a band called U2, and I'm actually from Ireland, not from New Jersey. And I was like, oh my God, I have so badly screwed this up. I was like, this is like, I just completely screwed up. And I was like, look, I'm sorry, conversation over. I'm sure you'll find somebody who is smarter
someone who
than
knows
I am
who
to
you
work
are,
for,
yeah.
that wants to work for you. Well, he thought that was hysterically funny, and loved it. And to this day, always likes to humiliate me in any opportunity he can when we're together to retell that story. But I think it was actually, as I look back at it now, I think it kind of level set us. I love him. He's in May. We worked together for almost 20 years on AIDS issues. He's totally dedicated to the issue, extremely smart, very hardworking, honestly, no ego. And one of the things I said to him at the beginning was if this is a public relations stunt, I'm not interested. I've had an opportunity to work with people who sincerely cared about him. Elizabeth Taylor was amazing. She was a passionate, thoughtful advocate for AIDS and did stuff for us when no one else would do things for us. And I'm like, I've had that experience. I don't need a celebrity trying to solve a public relations problem, kind of, posing around an issue like this. And I can say 20 plus years later, never had that experience with him. He always completely 100% dedicated to the issue. And it, and obviously the proof is in the pudding. PEPFAR, the Global Fund. I mean, the stuff that has happened, Millennial Challenge Corporation, the stuff that emerged out of the creation of the One campaign and the kind of attention Bono brought to the issue is, it is honestly almost miraculous.
But you toured with him.
I did. That was the
deal.
Well,
is that the right word to say?
It's not like you were playing.
No. And I would bop in and out. I didn't stay on the road. I couldn't. I had a full-time day job back in Washington. So the deal was the band was very generous about the use of time and the use of the concerts and backstage opportunities. But the rule was with the band amongst themselves is that if one member was using it for something like that, they had to staff it. We couldn't use the band's personnel because they were busy putting on a show. Right. So if we invited members of Congress or staffers or folks to go to a concert, we had to go and be with them. We had to supervise them. We had to get their credentials for them. We had to be with them backstage. So the rule was if we wanted to use the band and their resources, we had to basically staff it. And in those days, that was me. So I would literally leave Washington at 4 or 5 o'clock, fly to a city wherever they were playing, be there to do whatever we were doing backstage, and then I could never leave, that night because we were always too late. So I would either go with him to wherever they were going, or I'd stay at a motel at the end of an airport runway, and I would fly back on the first flight in the morning, do a whole day's worth of work, and then go back to the next city. So as I used to say to people, it was the most exhausting. I got more frequent flyer miles, but I was also a terrible roadie. I just was, I would literally put earplugs in and sit back behind stage and just do work. Because the whole day's worth of Washington work wasn't stopping. I had other clients that were doing other things. We were running the anti-tobacco lobby. We were working on gays in the military. Through that whole period of time, there was other stuff that was happening.
So you were going to all these Bono concerts, U2 concerts, and you weren't listening.
I was not listening. No. I was working. I get the senator or the congressman or their staff or whatever, their family members. I'd get them backstage. They'd meet Bono, take pictures. I'd get them out. We usually would put them on the soundboard. That's kind of where the VIP space was for us. I'd place them on the soundboard, and then I'd run backstage and then do emails and work, and go back and get them, bring them backstage for whatever after thing we were going, and then try and get some sleep and fly home and do it again. But we picked up more co-sponsors for PEPFAR, and we worked out more appropriations deals backstage at U2 concerts than we did probably in the Capitol if I counted them.
Have you found in your career that there are a handful of people who are so inherently cool that they sort of operate in a category unto themselves? They transcend all the usual barriers in life. They are the people that famous people get excited about meeting. A kind of validation of importance. In sports, it was Kobe.
Yeah.
In life, it seems to be Bono.
Yeah. I think that is true. But, he was also fascinated by meeting political figures. He thought it was, incredibly cool to meet, we had this very awkward meeting with Jesse Helms, who was my nemesis on the domestic AIDS front, opposed everything. Every AIDS bill we tried to bring forward was a filibuster threat from Jesse Helms. I mean, he was the arch enemy, for most of the 5 years around the domestic AIDS lobby. So he came later in life, and only on the international side of things, he came to another level of awareness about the disease and about its consequence and the fatality, and particularly around Africa, the children's situation in Africa. So he wanted to see Bono, and I had a Republican counterpart, lobbyist, so I was the Democratic side and kind of strategist, and then I had a Republican counterpart. So I was like, okay, great, just bring Scott with you to the Jesse Helms meeting. And Bono's like, no, you have to come to that meeting. I'm like, I'm not coming. And I'm like, you don't understand. It will not be good for me to come. Like, I'm not a good, productive person to be in the room with you. So let's Scott do that. We're strategic. He's like, no, you're coming to the meeting. And I sat in on that meeting with Bono, and he was fascinated by Jesse Helms, fascinated by who he was, fascinated by the kind of redemption story that he told him, that Jesse said to Bono, that, I've come to a new awakening. He described it as a religious experience. And Bono thought that was like the coolest thing in the world, and has repeated that story, hundreds and hundreds of times over, about what an incredible moment that was. It was an incredible moment. It was incredibly awkward.
Throughout your book, you break down key issues or legislative successes into three broad categories: policy, politics, and press. Put another way, the important categories are the goal, the challenges to accomplishment, and selling or controlling the message. Kind of applies to life.
Yeah.
Marriage, getting along with neighbors.
Yeah. It does. It really does. I think we talked about this a minute ago, but the first and most important thing is, we say policy is the first P, which is what is the problem and what is the solution? If you don't clearly understand those things in life, even approaching a neighbor over something like, we have a big construction project going on next door to us. Like, I understand the problem, which is it was an old house that needs to be completely redone. And I understand the solution, which is he needs time and a pretty ugly process to redo that house, and it'll be great at the end of the day. If you actually could just put problem and solution in your head, in a clear way, you're more than halfway to the finish line. Then you have to look at the politics. What are the real, complications? Is it, 7 p.m. on a Saturday night and your dinner guests are arriving and he's, still in his bulldozer going back and forth across the front lawn? And can you politically, carefully, come to a compromise on those things? And then at the end of the day, the idea of press is really about public attribution. You're right. It's about how do you get the Alleluia chorus? How do you get people to validate that that is the right solution to the problem around you? So that can be coalitions, it can be op-eds, it can be a grassroots campaign, but a sense that, yes, the community writ large wants to see this solution happen. If you put those three things together, you have the workings of a successful movement, campaign, issue organization, and they universally have. That has universally been my truth for 36 years in the business, and that's why in the book, every single chapter, single issue gets digested at the end of the chapter into those three parts, which is, okay, here's how the problem and solution were defined. Here's how the politics emerged and how we kind of either won or lost, in some of those political battles. And then here's what the validation strategy was about. Here's how we ran that strategy, and here's why it mattered in terms of the success of the campaign at the end of the day.
You were once able to use a movie as a way to introduce an issue and a solution. How helpful was the movie?
Extremely helpful. So this is about human trafficking and slavery. And a friend of mine who I had been working with on other issues, Pam Omidyar, they owned eBay and PayPal, and they're incredible couple, Pam and Pierre Omidyar. But Pam had been working on some issues, and I had been working with her on those. And she came to me in another meeting and said, I'm working on human trafficking and slavery, and I think I want it to be a bigger issue. And I said to her, what are you talking about? Like, we got rid of slavery, 250 years ago. Like, I don't understand the problem. And she's like, this is a big problem, and it's a current problem. And I'm like, Pam, the problem is that no one thinks it's a problem. And until you can make it a problem, you won't get the political capital necessary to try and solve the problem. And I'm like, I honestly don't think I can help you. You'd have to and she's a very wealthy woman, but I'm like, you'd have to spend a lot of money creating an environment where the problem was articulated. So I basically kind of said no. I didn't think there was the raw material to build a coalition or a campaign around it. 7 months later, we had a public relations division of the firm at the time, and we were approached by a movie company saying that they were going to do this movie called Amazing Grace, which was about, and it was the 100th anniversary of the Wilberforce Act, which was the end of slavery in England. And they were going to do a movie around those two things, the 100th anniversary and the captain of the ship the guy who wrote Amazing Grace was the captain of a slave ship and realized that what he was doing was horrible and went back and joined the clergy and wrote Amazing Grace. So it was about his story. It was about him being a slave ship owner. And they were doing this epic movie, and they wanted to do something at the end of the movie that would raise people's awareness around it. So they were going to put $7-8 million into getting people in movie theaters, and then putting a trailer at the end of the movie that says, if you want to get involved in current, this is how to do it. So they didn't have anything to attach it to. So they come to our public relations division asking if we could create something. And I'm like, hang on a minute. I think we might. And Pam had been funding all of these very nascent organizations that had been working on modern day human trafficking and slavery. So I said to Pam, can you get the providers together in a room in like the next 3 weeks, and so I can discuss with them whether there's a legislative solution. Could we put a Wilberforce Anniversary Act together that has kind of new ideas for how to manage modern day slavery? And she got them together, and we had this incredible 3-day meeting where we came up with 32 ideas for approaching human trafficking and slavery as a modern issue. We got the legislation together and had it introduced in time for the movie's release, and then the movie trailer was asking all these people who had seen this movie and been moved by it to kind of send a note to their member of Congress or senator to support it. So we engineered an entire legislative campaign around the fact that this opportunity to get $7 million and hundreds of thousands of people, as they say, butts and seats in movie theaters, they were going to do the public education campaign for us. All we had to do was have something to direct it to. So it was when you think about how you would engineer these things logically and thoughtfully, you would say start with the problem, go to the solution, and then build your strategy. In this case, we had a grassroots campaign that was asking for something to connect to, and so we engineered it backwards, and it worked.
That's fantastic. Did your training as a social worker help dealing with clients, or perhaps more specifically with members of Congress?
Well, I used to say to people, if social workers deal with things that are dysfunctional in society, and if you want to deal with dysfunction, being on Capitol Hill on a day-to-day basis was a great way to do social work intervention with the dysfunctional. So I used to say that to people all the time. It was the best training. I'm like, if you're a lawyer, you're trained to go to court where it's ordered and there are rules. If you're a social worker, you're trained to deal with dysfunction. I think I was better prepared for most people going in. But my first job as a social worker was opening up group homes for people with developmental disabilities in New York after the deinstitutionalization court order. So these institutions were full of people with developmental disabilities, and they were court-ordered out of the institutions. So we rapidly had to create a community environment for them, and my job was to get these community residences open. But the worst part of the job was that I had to get zoning board changes because congregate living facilities in many of these small suburban New York towns that I grew up in were not permitted. So we had to get variances from zoning boards. And if you want to do rough and difficult, sometimes actually dirty politics, go to a local zoning board. Like, people say, how do you work on Capitol Hill? It's so wow. You know, I'm like, Capitol Hill is a breeze. Go to your local zoning board. You want to see nasty? It gets really nasty at the zoning board level.
You grew up in New York City. In New York. Is that right?
I was born in New York City, but raised just outside, about 30 miles north along the Hudson River.
And was this sort of a New York version of a suburb?
Definitely a New York version of a suburb, yes.
And then where did you go for school?
I went to school locally, a little place called Dominican College, a small Catholic college where I had a full scholarship, and I'm one of 5 kids in our Irish Catholic family, and I did not want to go to this college, but my parents were like, you have a full scholarship to college, you're taking the full scholarship, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It happened to have been, it's the order of nuns that my mother's sister was my aunt in this order, the Dominicans of Blauvelt, and so I went to the Dominican College of Blauvelt, and the dean of students on my first day at college had also been my 8th grade teacher. And yes, and my professor for advanced biology and chemistry had also taught me science in the 6th grade. So it was all a little too close for comfort. And most of these nuns I'd known my whole life. And I'd been on the college is in the Mother House campus, and I'd been there, many, many, many times as a kid to visit my aunt, and they used to have this big festival every year. So it was all way too parochial, using the smaller sense of parochial as well as the religious sense of parochial. It was all way too parochial for me, and I honestly did not want to go there. But I had an incredible education, very strict, very Catholic, college education. We had no electives our first 2 years, none. We were classically trained, and we were, you took humanities, you took Latin, Greek, you took, philosophy, and then you could choose your major, as long as it was only bachelors of science. There were no BAs that the college gave in those days. Yeah, only BSs. So I had to take advanced biology and chemistry, although I wanted to be a social work major.
And you knew then that's what you wanted to do?
I did know then that I thought that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do something in the kind of social change space. It had always been kind of part of my DNA even as a little kid.
You are known as an exceptional sailor, both here and elsewhere. When did the sailing bug hit?
My dad was in the Coast Guard, so we used to spend lots of time out on the water on boats. But we had a house on Long Beach Island, New Jersey, which is 65 miles due north of here, and our house was on the ocean side, but it's only 2 blocks. The whole island's only 2 blocks wide. So the house was on the ocean side, but on the bay side was a yacht club, and they just had little puffers, pintails, little boats. My cousins had a little boat we christened the Mayflower. It was a 12-foot day sailor. So we'd spend mornings at the beach and afternoons on the water, on the bay, sailing, and it just became kind of my happy place. And over the years, I just graduated, up to bigger and bigger boats, and I got my captain's license when I was 21.
What is it about sailing boats that, unlike other types, it seems to be once you get hit with it, once you get into it, you can never get out?
Not to get overly groovy about it, but if there's a zen that goes with when the sails go up and it's just you and the wind and your boat, and there's no other noise except the wind and the sails or the water lapping against, there's a certain kind of mesmerizing tranquility that comes at that moment. And, Kevin, you know this, like, we work in Washington, it's intense. It can get, hard. I mean, these battles are hard fought when you're in the middle of them. And when I get on the boat, I just, because there's enough to do. You have to be paying attention. You can't just be kind of winging it. There's enough focus and then enough tranquility. And when everything gets set right, the sails are up, the engine's off. We're heading out to the lighthouse, particularly here because we just head out to Roosevelt Inlet and usually head out to the blue water. We'll head out there, and there's just something in that moment when it all just clicks into this very peaceful, tranquil Zen place, and it just my soul literally refreshes. I just dump all the tension and I just focus on being on the boat and sailing it and getting it right. When you get everything just right on a boat, it kind of just hums along in its own space. There's something totally magical about it.
What is it about Lewis that you found so appealing that you decided to live here part-time?
So my husband now, but when we met 38 years ago, he had a house already here on 2nd Street, right across from St. Peter's Church. And I was in the middle of, I was still at Child Welfare League, but it was during my transition from Child Welfare League to AIDS Action. And honestly, I would come down and it was pretty rough. I mean, there was 15, 20-hour days frequently. So I would get here on a Friday night or sometimes on a Saturday morning, and, it was quiet. I could go into Rehoboth, but at the time I didn't really want to spend a lot of time in Rehoboth because people would just talk to you at the bar and tell you what they thought you were doing right or wrong. There's just a certain level of that you can only take so much of that. And you're like, I get you're all watching from the bleachers telling me what you think I should be doing. But so I just found this to be a very quiet, happy place. I love the water and I love being near the water. It's for me that it's very therapeutic. And I could sit on the front porch. And at the time, I had a golden retriever, and we would sit on the front porch at 2nd Street. And Crosby would go lay in the middle of 2nd Street. He'd go when the boatyard was behind where the in a canal square is. Crosby would just walk himself over there, go for a swim in the canal, come on back to the house. It was super quiet and very chill, and it just became the place where I filled up. I think anyone who does the kind of work that we've done, and kind of high pressure, high visibility, high stakes, and if you care about the outcome of the work that you're doing, that's all great. But you have to have a place that you fill up. You can't just keep putting out that level of energy and not have some place where you feel like you can relax, take a breath, and recharge your battery. And so Lewis became that place for me. It became the place I would come to recharge. It also then became a place where we gathered friends. It then became a place where we gathered family. My mother's 70th birthday party was in the backyard at the house on 2nd Street. It just became this kind of gathering space because the energy was so great. And it wasn't always like that. I mean, Vince was kind of a pioneer in Lewis. He was one of the first few openly gay people that lived here, and it wasn't friendly. The mayor sent him a letter one day saying his kind of people were not welcome in Lewis, and that if he really wanted to have a house, he might consider Rehoboth as someplace. But Lewis was not that kind of town. And when we renovated the barn, the city manager told me that that it was considered a single family residence, and he didn't define us as family people. It was rough. There was it wasn't what it is today, which is why we so appreciate the evolution of Lewis. But there was some in those early days. It was not so friendly and not so accepting, and that slowly I think came about by being, if you're a good neighbor, if you're participating in the town, if you're not riling people's anxieties, if you kind of can just figure out a way to blend and to be yourself. We never pretended not to be who we were. We just were kind of just quietly. My husband's a great gardener, so I think he largely kind of tried to woo people with a really, really pretty garden in the front. He always wanted a beauty spot. He's never gotten a beauty spot. He's still looking to get if anyone's listening, he still would like to get a beauty spot. But we just tried to be good neighbors, and it became a place where we could really relax and have fun. And we got to know people here, which was, that was a really important. Creating community in Lewis became a very important part of why we feel so connected.
You have 3 horses?
I do. I just got the 3rd one last week.
Where did that come? Were you riding as a kid?
Yeah, my grandfather. So my grandmother that did the Mother Teresa line, her husband, my mother's father, was an equestrian before he left Ireland. He used to train horses for fox hunting. That was his job as a kid. And when he came to America, that was not possible. He went to work as a streetcar driver, actually, in the Bronx. But he always rode his whole life. And when I was little, my brother and my sister and I are Irish triplets. So my grandmother used to come to we were living in the Bronx at the time. My grandmother would come over to the apartment to help my mother, and my grandfather would take me, because my brother was a little older. I was in the middle, and Kathy was an infant. My grandfather would take me out for the day just to get one kid out of the nest. So like a year or so later, my mother finally said to her father, like, "Where are you going? Like, where do you go every day?" Like, he would go for the day. And she'd say, "Where do you take Thomas for the whole day?" And he said, "We go ride." We lived right on Van Cortlandt Park. He said, "I take him to the stables and we go riding." And so I think it just started when I was a little kid. And that was what I did with my grandfather for every major occasion of my life. My birthday, first communion, confirmation, graduation, I would run home, change into my riding clothes, and he and I would go riding together, and we did it until he died. And he was a natural horseman. He had a horse whisperer quality. Like, he literally, as a little kid, he could take a whole pen of horses and he'd say, "Well, which one do you like?" And I'd have to name the right color, the right breed, I'd get all the stuff right. And he'd say, "Okay, well, I'll get the dapple gray to come over to the fence." And I had sugar cube in my pocket, but when that horse comes, you have to give him the sugar cube, because that's the deal. And he could literally, out of 20 or 30 horses, get the dapple gray horse to come to the fence. Murphy was my first Irish thoroughbred, a big chestnut, and I had him he lived until he was 25. Now we have 2 Oldenburgs, and I just bought a new Irish sport horse, a 3-year-old dapple gray,
The Children's Beach House is a proud part of Lewis history. How did you get involved?
So a friend of mine took a contract helping write grants for them, and he had been our development director at AIDS Action, and had been a friend who had shared our house here on 2nd Street. And then when he got ready to kind of change his life and lifestyle, he moved to Milton and took a consulting job helping the Children's Beach House write grants. So Barry basically said to me, "You really should get to know these guys, and you should get to know the executive director, Rich Garrett, and I think you'd really appreciate it." And because the Children's Beach House really specializes in kids with disabilities as a kind of a special focus of our mission and work, he said, "I think you'd really find the organization interesting, and you might want to." And largely it was about fundraising to begin with, to be honest. Would you be willing to support them?
As is true of so many boards. Right?
Exactly. And then as time went on and I got to know Rich better and he asked me to join the board, what really became obvious was that the organization, really needed a reset. We needed to reimagine ourselves. That everyone in town kind of thinks of it as a physical property, and just for the summertime. Well, every kid that comes to our summer camp is actually followed 24/7 all year long. We follow them back home to Wilmington or to, outer Newcastle County or to Kent County. We follow them all over the state, so that all year long we're paying attention to their integration in their school systems. We're paying attention to their family dynamics. Most of these kids are not only challenged with a disability, but they come from families that are deeply challenged. No one actually knew that, and I didn't honestly know that until I got involved with the board. And then honestly, COVID hit, and we were shut down because we were so our physical plant was so part of how we showed up in the community and how we delivered our services. We had to reimagine what else could we be doing if we couldn't bring kids to camp, or we couldn't bring kids to the child care center, if we weren't physically able to use the space. And we realized we had this incredible location, this great spot. We had this huge commercial kitchen that was, not able to do anything, and we decided to start reimagining how we could do things a little bit differently, and started a social enterprise called The Greater Good Catering. So we're using the commercial kitchen when it's not in use for the kids, and for camp we use it as a catering kitchen. We have a great location, so there's no kids there on the weekends, so we can put a tent up on the dunes and people can have a beautiful wedding, on the bay. But I think the most important thing we did in COVID was to say we have to get away from our physical footprint. We have to get into community, not bring community to us. So we picked Milton as our first foray into doing more intensive community activity, to go into the community with families and kids to see if we can help relieve some of the pressures that are on particularly families with kids with disabilities. So we're doing an huge after-school program in Milton. We're thinking about maybe doing an early childhood development program there. We were at capacity here in Lewis, and there's a great need to do it. And we're looking at the family and the community more as one whole system, not just the kid and serving just the kid, but what do those kids need inside their families, and what do their families need inside their communities, and then doing work that puts that together as a more holistic idea. And so far, it's scary to step way out of your comfort zone, but like we imagined doing maybe 100 kids in after-school programs over 5 years in Milton, and we were at 225 3 weeks into. As soon as we opened the doors to the idea of an after-school program, we had almost 300 kids.
Tom, one last question. If you had the chance to go back in time and sit down with the 20-year-old Tom Sheridan, what would you tell him?
Not to be in such a rush. I was very impatient, but some of that impatience paid off. I mean, because I never took no for an answer. I just didn't, it's always been my personality. Even as a little kid, my mother would tell you that. She always said my worst attribute was I had no patience. I probably would have made less mistakes if I had been a little more patient. I would definitely say that. I would probably also advise him to let serendipity, trust serendipity a little more. Like, things showed up in my life that I did not expect, and that were amazing gifts, but I didn't really realize they were gifts until much later in the process. Like, to have worked with Senator Kennedy, and then to have him, tell his, nephew Bobby, to have Bono, otherwise known as Bon Jovi, call me, like stuff like that just doesn't always happen. And I didn't always recognize the gift of that. These opportunities come in these incredible gifts that you don't always recognize as gifts. And then your sense of gratitude for them comes later in life. And so I would be more grateful for all of those things that have come my way earlier. And in some ways, been able to express that gratitude a little bit more gracefully in my younger days. I was brasher and more bombastic and those things. And looking back, if I had recognized the grace that was coming with that and the gratitude that was coming with those gifts, I probably would have been a little cooler.
Tom, thanks for joining us today, for talking about your story, about all that you've accomplished. For those of us who know the world of DC and lobbying, it is a remarkable and pioneering career that you've had. And I don't know what you're doing next, but what you have already accomplished is amazing.
Thank you, Evan.
And thanks for being part of our community and for all that you have and are still giving this town. Thanks to today's sponsor, the sister restaurants Kindle and Half Full. There's a reason you may have to wait a few minutes for a table. They're that good. Good news. The We and Lewis baseball caps are back in stock at Shorebreak in downtown Lewis. I hope you'll pick one up and show your support. They look good on everyone, and anecdotal evidence has proven conclusively they make everyone look better. It must be the colors. Thank you for listening to today's episode, and when you can, stop for a moment and take the time to enjoy our town, which some of us are lucky enough to call home. Till next time, this has been We and Lewis, the podcast.